Why it sucks to be a eunuch in Imperial China. You're 9 years old and your family is starving. Your father sits you down and tells you there's a way out. Not just for you, but for the whole family. A neighbor's son went through it 2 years ago. He sends money home now. He eats meat. He sleeps indoors. All it costs is one irreversible operation, performed by a man in the village who does this for a living, and a life spent inside the walls of the largest palace on earth. You don't fully understand what you're agreeing to. You're 9. Within days, the procedure happens. If you survive it, and thousands didn't, you'll spend the rest of your life as a eunuch in the Forbidden City. Some of you will die servants, invisible and forgotten. A vanishingly small handful of you will become some of the most powerful human beings on the planet, capable of making or breaking emperors. Today, we're breaking down why being a eunuch in Imperial China was one of the strangest bargains in human history. A trade of your body for a shot, however small, at power no ordinary person could ever touch. Let's be clear about who actually became a eunuch in Imperial China, because it wasn't a random cross-section of society. Overwhelmingly, it was the desperately poor. Families facing famine, debt, or simply no path to survival for a son would make this decision, sometimes with the boy's understanding, often without it, especially when he was very young. A self-inflicted or family-arranged castration, performed by specialized practitioners who did nothing else for a living, was one of the only guaranteed paths into palace employment. And palace employment meant food, shelter, and a steady wage in a country where neither was guaranteed to most people. The procedure itself was primitive and dangerous. Performed without modern anesthesia or antiseptic technique, mortality rates were significant. Historians estimate death rates from the operation and its aftermath ranged anywhere from 2 to 6%, sometimes higher during periods when the procedure was rushed or poorly supervised. Survivors faced a recovery period of days spent in agony. Walking was often impossible, and infection was a constant life-threatening risk. And here's the detail that made this decision almost impossible to reverse. Candidates were required to preserve the removed body part, traditionally kept in a sealed jar, sometimes for their entire lives. Tradition held that a man needed to be buried whole to be considered complete in the afterlife, so eunuchs kept these remains carefully, sometimes purchasing them back at great expense if they'd been lost, or in darker cases, held hostage by unscrupulous brokers who profited from the desperation of men trying to reclaim what tradition demanded they be buried with. This wasn't a career choice made with dignity and full information. It was a decision made, often by children or their desperate parents, under the crushing weight of poverty, with no real alternative on the table. Once you passed inspection and were accepted, you entered one of the strictest, most hierarchical workplaces that has ever existed. The Forbidden City required eunuch labor on a staggering scale. At its peak, the Imperial Palace employed somewhere between 8 and 10,000 eunuchs simultaneously. The reasoning behind this system was brutally practical from the emperor's perspective. Eunuchs could work inside the palace's inner chambers, in close daily contact with the emperor's wives, concubines, and daughters, without any risk of an illegitimate bloodline being introduced into the imperial family. You were, in the eyes of the system that employed you, a solution to a specific biological problem, not a person with your own ambitions. Life inside the palace hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving. New eunuchs entered at the absolute bottom, performing the most menial tasks imaginable, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, hauling water and firewood across the palace's enormous grounds from before dawn until well after dark. Senior eunuchs who had accumulated any status treated new arrivals with open contempt, sometimes outright cruelty, in a hierarchy that mirrored and in some ways exceeded the brutality of the outside world you'd been trying to escape. And Chinese society at large did not simply forget where you came from once you passed through the palace gates. Eunuchs were widely viewed with a mixture of fear, contempt, and superstition. Confucian philosophy, which dominated Chinese social and political thought for centuries, held the body as a sacred inheritance from one's parents. Deliberately altering it was considered a profound violation of filial piety, one of the highest values in Chinese culture. In the eyes of many scholars and officials, you had committed something close to a sin against your own ancestors, regardless of the poverty that had driven the decision. You had traded your body and a significant piece of your social standing for entry into a system that would use you constantly and respect you rarely. Here's where the story gets genuinely strange, because for a small number of eunuchs, this system offered something no other path in Imperial China could: a route to power completely outside the traditional channels of birth, wealth, or scholarly examination. Ordinary Chinese men climbed the social ladder, if they climbed it at all, through the imperial examination system. A grueling, years-long process of studying classical texts, competing against tens of thousands of candidates for a small number of official positions. It favored the wealthy, who could afford tutors and time away from labor. Eunuchs had no access to this system at all. But they had something the examination system couldn't offer anyone: physical proximity to the most powerful person in the empire, every single day, often starting in early childhood. An emperor's closest eunuch attendants sometimes served him from boyhood, present at his most private moments, trusted with his correspondence, his meals, his security, his secrets. Over years and sometimes decades, that proximity could translate into genuine influence. An emperor who trusted almost no one at court might trust the eunuch who had been at his side since he was a child. A small number of eunuchs leveraged this proximity into staggering political power. Wei Zhongxian, serving during the late Ming dynasty, effectively controlled the imperial court for years, placing allies in key government positions, ordering the deaths of political rivals, and accumulating a personal cult of loyalty so extensive that officials across the empire built shrines in his honor while he was still alive. Zheng He, perhaps the most famous eunuch in Chinese history, commanded massive naval fleets on diplomatic and exploratory voyages that reached as far as East Africa, decades before European ships attempted similar journeys. A level of command and trust granted to almost no one else in the empire, eunuch or otherwise. These stories are genuinely remarkable. They're also the exception that proves how narrow this path actually was. For every Wei Zhongxian or Zheng He, there were thousands of eunuchs who spent their entire lives cleaning latrines and never rose above the lowest ranks of palace service. Whenever eunuchs did accumulate real power, it triggered fierce, often violent backlash from the traditional scholar official class, who viewed eunuch political influence as a corruption of the natural order. Confucian officials, who had spent years mastering classical texts to earn their positions through examination, deeply resented seeing eunuchs, men they considered physically incomplete and socially beneath them, wielding influence over imperial decisions. Historical records from multiple dynasties are filled with scathing denunciations of eunuch cliques, blamed for corruption, misgovernment, and the decline of imperial authority. Several dynasties, including the Ming, experienced periods of intense political conflict, specifically framed as scholar officials versus eunuch factions, with purges, executions, and forced suicide striking eunuchs who fell from favor. When a powerful eunuch's patron emperor died or turned against him, the fall could be swift and absolute. Wei Zhongxian, at the height of his power feared across the empire, was stripped of his position within weeks of his patron's death and died by suicide while being escorted to exile, anticipating the execution that surely awaited him otherwise. His extensive network of allies was purged, his shrines torn down, his name turned into a byword for corrupt eunuch overreach for centuries afterward. This was the fundamental instability underlying even the most successful eunuch careers. Your power, no matter how extensive, was never truly yours. It was borrowed entirely from your proximity to the emperor, and the moment that proximity ended, through death, disfavor, or a change in dynasty, you had no independent power base, no family lineage to fall back on, no army, no landed estate. You had built your entire life around a connection that could be severed in a single afternoon. Set aside political power for a moment and consider what an ordinary eunuch's life actually looked like, because the vast majority never came anywhere close to Wei Zhongxian's story. You could not have biological children, the single most consequential loss in a culture that placed enormous weight on continuing the family line and having descendants to perform ancestral rites after your death. Many eunuchs addressed this the only way available to them: adopting sons, often other eunuchs' relatives, or purchased children to carry on a family name and, crucially, to perform funeral rites and ancestor worship after their death. Because dying without descendants to honor you was considered a genuinely terrifying spiritual fate in traditional Chinese belief. Marriage, while not strictly forbidden for eunuchs, was unusual and carried its own complications and social stigma. Some eunuchs did form domestic partnerships, occasionally even with palace women, in arrangements that were technically against palace rules, but quietly tolerated in certain periods, born from simple human loneliness inside an institution that offered almost no space for it. Physically, many eunuchs experienced significant hormonal changes over their lifetimes, depending on the age at which the procedure occurred. Changes in voice, body composition, and appearance that made them visually distinct, and that were sometimes mocked openly by the very court officials whose robes and salaries a eunuch might be personally responsible for maintaining. And there was nowhere else to go. Having left your birth family, often as a young child, and having no standing whatsoever in ordinary Chinese society outside the palace walls, the Forbidden City wasn't just your workplace. For thousands of eunuchs, it was the only home, the only community, and the only source of identity they would ever have. For better, and very often for worse. And yet, buried inside this brutal system, there's a genuinely surprising thread worth pulling on. Some eunuchs became remarkable figures in Chinese history for reasons that had nothing to do with political intrigue. Zheng He's voyages weren't just displays of naval power. They opened diplomatic and trade relationships across the Indian Ocean that reshaped China's relationship with the wider world, decades ahead of comparable European exploration, and he's remembered today respectfully as one of history's great maritime explorers. Kai Lun, a eunuch serving in the Han Dynasty imperial court, is traditionally credited with refining and popularizing the paper-making process, a technological leap that would eventually transform the entire world's relationship with written knowledge, centuries before paper reached Europe. These weren't isolated flukes. Because eunuchs occupied a uniquely central position inside the one institution, the imperial court, that concentrated China's resources, records, workshops, and scholarly knowledge in one place, a small number of talented eunuchs found themselves with genuine opportunities for innovation and achievement that simply weren't available to ordinary people locked into rigid social and economic roles outside the palace walls. The system that stripped these men of their bodies, their family names, and their social standing also, paradoxically, placed a handful of them at the exact center of the most technologically and administratively sophisticated civilization on Earth at the time. And a few of them used that position to leave a mark on human history far larger than almost anyone born into ordinary circumstances ever could. Being a eunuch in Imperial China meant trading your body, your bloodline, and a significant piece of your social dignity for entry into the one institution in the empire where poverty didn't have to be a permanent life sentence. For the overwhelming majority, that trade bought a life of hard, invisible labor and quiet social contempt. For a small handful, it bought access to power, innovation, and historical significance that birth, wealth, and the examination system could never have offered them. Nearly all of it rested on a decision made in childhood, sometimes by a 9-year-old, sometimes by his desperate parents, about a body and a future that boy was never really given the chance to choose for himself. If you enjoyed this video, there are more stories on the channel about what it was like to be someone completely different in a completely different era. See you in the next one.